we're also seeing trends in different ecological crises as well. So you can see there the proportion of domesticated land has increased, the rate of tropical forest loss is accelerating, and rates of biodiversity are declining quite rapidly as well. So it's all a bit doom and gloom. But the thing is, what are the kind of common solutions which might be able to address both of those things? Things like addressing non-communicable diseases, particularly preventing people getting ill in the first place, and things which can also protect habitats and increase nature in our environments. Well, one of those things are the development and protection of natural environments. And the World Health Organization produced this report in 2017 about interventions to increase or improve urban green spaces and their impacts on health and well-being. And they seem fairly convinced in this particular report. So this is a quote from it: "The intervention to increase or improve urban green space can deliver positive health, social and environmental outcomes for all population groups, particularly among lower socioeconomic status groups. And there are very few, if any, other public health interventions that can achieve all of this, especially the impact on active lifestyles, mental well-being, and social interaction." So when I give these kinds of presentations, a lot of people don't like the way I medicalise nature necessarily. But if you'll indulge me for a second, if you think of nature as a pill, for example, and you were to take that pill, and that pill helped you become more active, maybe it improved your mental health, maybe it helped you socialise or become less lonely, and also it helped fight climate change, and also it helps mitigate biodiversity loss, and you think, well, that's a pretty good pill to take. So if nature can have all of those benefits simultaneously, then it may be part of the solution to some of those health and environmental crises which are completely interlinked. So the question then, is nature a feasible and acceptable means by which we can improve public physical and mental health? I would argue that it is. So not only does nature have scale, so for example in the European Union, 4% of all land use is actually artificial land, so buildings. That may seem surprising because most of us will live in towns and cities. But if you look across the scale of the entire European Union, that is the case. So nature is kind of everywhere. So it's feasible. And also, is nature acceptable? Well, at least in the UK, we have really good statistics on the amount of time that people spend in natural environments for leisure and for recreation. And in the UK, 66% of people visit nature at least once a week for leisure or recreation. So 2/3 of the entire adult population. So in other words, most of us are already interacting with nature on a fairly regular basis anyway. So broadly speaking, we could consider nature as an acceptable means of promoting public health and well-being, because it's something that we already do, already interact with. So that takes me on to how we've looked at the relationships between nature and health in research. This framework that I've presented on the screen here is not an exhaustive one, so I'm not going to cover lots of the indirect ways in which nature can benefit health and well-being, such as things like carbon sequestration or the provision of fruit and vegetables and food and fish, etc. So I'm not going to cover those kinds of ecosystem services today. The kinds of things I'm going to be focusing on are mostly what might be referred to as cultural ecosystem services, or the kinds of behaviours that can be supported by interactions with nature. So hopefully you can see my mouse here. On the left-hand side of this diagram, we have nature itself, the types of nature, the qualities of nature, and its availability. So for example, parks, countryside, sea, lakes, oceans. The qualities of nature that might be how biodiversity is, what kinds of amenities it has, and its availability. So how accessible is it to me on a daily basis? Do I live near these natural environments? Are they easily accessible if I'm in a wheelchair, let's say, for example? So all of those types, qualities, and availabilities of nature can impact the kinds of contact I have with it. That contact might be completely indirect. So it may be something that is just in my neighbourhood and I don't interact with it, or it may be something I can see out of my window, but I don't necessarily interact with it. It might be incidental. So for example, I drove to work today, and incidentally there were lots of trees and nice sort of wooded kind of avenues that I drove through, so it's not something which I intentionally exposed myself to, but it was incidental to my commute. Or it might be intentional. So I deliberately go to natural environments to spend time there, whether that's for work or whether that's for leisure. And those different types of contact can lead to these different sorts of mechanisms. So for example, nature in my neighbourhood, I might not have to have any contact with it for it to mitigate some harms. For example, for it to mitigate my exposure to air pollution or to reduce the extreme heats that I may be exposed to, for example. But certain types of contact with nature and how long I spend there and what kinds of activities I do might impact things like how much physical activity I'm achieving or the kinds of people that I'm coming into contact with. It also might help me restore myself from stressful states or restore myself from attentional fatigue, as I was saying at the start. And all of these different kinds of mechanisms might lead, therefore, to better overall physical and mental health. It might reduce my risk of non-communicable diseases. It might reduce my risk of early mortality. It might improve my mental health. It might decrease loneliness, for example. And what's interesting as well is these interventions down here on the bottom left. So infrastructural interventions can change the types or qualities or availability of nature. So I might improve parks in my neighbourhood, or I might try to increase accessibility of them. And that therefore has downstream impacts on my mental health and well-being. Or I might develop social interventions, interventions which try to connect people with the natural world more often or in different ways. That changes the types of contact that I have with nature, and again, therefore may have downstream impacts on my health and well-being. And it's this kind of research framework which I'm going to take you through today and give you some sort of illustrations, fairly non-critical, I would say, but some illustrations of the research that links different parts of this diagram. Okay, so before I do that, I'll just check if there's any questions at the moment. I can't see any in the Q&A. If you do have questions for me, just keep putting them in the Q&A and I'll stop periodically to check whether there's been particular questions asked about any of this evidence. So I'm going to focus initially then on the relationship between nature and mortality, which, as I said before, is kind of the ultimate health outcome, if you like. So that's where I am on the diagram. I'm focusing on the types or availabilities of nature and how it impacts overall health and well-being, in this case, mortality. So this is a really famous study from England, which used English mortality records from 2001 to 2005. So a sample size of around 40 million people, or in other words, all of the adults living in England at that time. And what they were able to do was assign an amount of green space that people lived in the neighbourhoods where they died. And this was basically derived from a land use database, which is called the Generalised Land Use Database. You might have heard of European products like Corin Land Cover Map, for example. It's a similar sort of tool. And what it does is it divides all the neighbourhoods in England up into sort of 20% quintiles, what we call quintiles, of green space. So the lowest quintile would be areas with the poorest access to green space. The highest quintile would be the areas with the best access to green space. And what they were interested in this study was the association between how green their neighbourhood was where they lived and these particular outcomes. So all-cause mortality before retirement age, in other words, dying before you were supposed to, and deaths from circulatory disease, so cardiovascular disease, things like heart attacks, etc., before retirement age as well. And essentially what they found is that relative to the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of accessibility, the more green space you have in your neighbourhood, the less likely you are to die before retirement age. So on the graph on the right-hand side here, you see group 2, 3, 4, and 5. What that's being compared to is group 1, so people with the worst accessibility of green space. And what you see here in group 5 is they're significantly less likely to die before retirement age. That's what this incidence rate ratio means. Now, I've just noticed that somebody in the chat said, what about confounders? So that's a really good point. So what is it about living in a green space, in a green environment, which might affect your likelihood of dying before retirement age? Perhaps you're more affluent and you can afford to live in a nicer environment. And that also means that you can afford resources that provide you with better healthcare or a better chance of not dying early, let's say. Some of those kinds of confounders were taken into account in this study. but not all of them, because these were just mortality records. We didn't necessarily know a lot about the people that were in the study. So really good point, Eleni, and I'll come on to some studies which do control better for confounders in a minute. The other thing about this study was that it just looked at patterns with mortality. They also looked at the relationship between inequalities, income inequalities, green space, and mortality as well. So what they found is that the differences in mortality incidence across different income groups are less pronounced in greener areas. So what I'm talking about there is these bars on the right-hand side of the diagram here. So these are the different income groups, and this is the gap in mortality. And you can see that that mortality gap is narrower in those people living in the greenest areas. So what that suggested to the authors is that the greenness of these living environments might be associated with reduced inequalities in mortality. And these results have been confirmed now in several longitudinal studies across the world. I referred you there to a systematic review of longitudinal studies. Why is that important? Well, that's important because this study in particular took death and took the address at which they died. And of course, often things happen like moving to retirement homes and moving to different places when you're a bit older, which aren't necessarily representative of all of the kinds of natural environments you've been exposed to across your lifetime, and which therefore may have an influence on your likelihood of dying from these particular non-communicable diseases. So that's why these longitudinal studies are particularly important. They can take a more life course approach, look at all the kinds of environments you've lived through over time, and get a better picture of whether green space is indeed protective of early mortality. But that has been confirmed in several longitudinal cohort studies across the world. I noticed there are lots of questions going into the Q&A as well, so I will try to address some of these. There is going to be content on spending time in green spaces and gardens later, and it's not just going to be about mortality as well. So one of the things we can do, because we have such good epidemiologic data now, and cohort data on the greenness in which people live over time and their reduced risk of early mortality, we can also do things like health impact assessments, which allow us to ask what would happen if greenness was increased by a certain amount over time in certain places. And that's what this study by Barbosa and colleagues tried to do. So one target that has been set out is that every person should have access to half a hectare of green space within 300 metres of their home. This is a target now in UK planning policy, for instance. And they looked across 978 European cities, and they found that only 38% of the population of these cities actually met that target. And there's big differences across countries and cities as well. So, for example, only 12% meet that particular target in Athens, but 56% meet that target in Prague, let's say. So another quick question for you then, and you can put A, B, or C into the chat. How many premature deaths do you think could be avoided if these European cities all met this target? So is it up to 16,000 deaths, up to 32,000 deaths, or up to 64,000 deaths? A, B, or C in the chat. Lots of C's, a couple of B's. So most people are saying C, I think, here. C or B. Nobody's going for the least one. You're absolutely right that between 33,000 and 64,000 deaths could be avoided every single year in these European cities if they met this target. Now, you might think that's quite a small number, given the amount of people that live in 1,000 cities in Europe, but that is between 2 and 3.5% of total natural cause mortality. And what's important is the impacts are greatest in different places. So the greatest impacts could be seen in Athens, which is not surprising, given that they have some of the least are less likely to meet this target, but also in cities like Brussels, Budapest, Copenhagen, and Riga. So all of these cities show the highest mortality burden due to the lack of green space. Somebody's asked, is this a study that led to the 330-300 rule? It's one of the studies that led to this. So the 300 rule was based on lots of the evidence coming out, lots of policy changes coming about that actually have started to recommend 300 metres as a target for accessible green space. And the 330-300 rule was developed from that. You're absolutely right. So that takes me through a little